Super happy to present this paper today, No Blood in My Mobile Regulating Foreign Suppliers. So the motivation for this paper is that today we know that in a lot of downstream industries, there is a growing demand for a large set of mineral products. So think, for example, about the tech industry. For in your smartphone, you have more than 30 different metals, but also the automobile sector and all of the new green technologies are going to demand that we mine a lot of those products. The issue is that often for those very specific metals, you have a small set of exporting countries. And in those countries where the extraction is undertaken, we know that sometimes extraction can be linked to adverse outcomes. So take the example of the metal of tantalum that is used in your smartphone and in your laptop. 30 to 50% of it is mined in the center of Africa. And there it's often linked to conflict, environmental degradation, child labor, and a lot of different other issues. So this is obviously an issue for the extracting country, but this is also an issue for the importing countries, the one where you have the industry using those metals. First, on a legal or moral standpoint, because you should not perpetuate this type of situation. And then there is also another argument is that if you source from this type of context, then you might expose yourself also to a risk of supply disruption. So the response that have been implemented, and this is the case in other sectors also, this is not only, you could think of those issues not only linked to the mineral and mining sector. And so the response of those importing countries, the one that are more downstream, has been to implement more and more a unilateral response. And this unilateral response is what is called due diligence policies. So in those due diligence policies, countries try to constrain companies into being accountable and transparent for any negative impact that they could cause directly or indirectly through subsidiaries or suppliers abroad. So the first one would be in the US in 2010, and we are going to talk about this law, but there is one also in France, in Germany, and several in the EU. So let's take the example of this first due diligence policy in the US. This policy was signed in 2010, and it regulated the biggest listed firm there and try to constrain those firms not to source any conflict mineral in a very specific set of African countries. And those firms were constraining their sources, not only themselves, but also their suppliers. And the US tried to exert some constraint and also launch some complaints from those firms through some disclosure and transparency mechanism. However, we don't know how well this type of new extraterritorial policy can be enforced in the state of extraction because it's a trade instrument. Those policies are trying to run through the industrial linkages abroad of the regulated firms with an extraterritorial objective, trying to regulate production processes in extraction states in a context where you have weak state capacity. And in those type of contexts, there can be more incentive to try to avoid regulation because they are too costly or complicated to enforce. And we know from the literature in international law, actually, that internationally, globally, you have some territories that could provide this legal avoidance by creating very opacity that would very much undermine the disclosure and transparency that tries to create the constraint of due diligence policies. And this opacity is supplied through territories that are called legal havens, so jurisdictions that adopt laws offering advantages to entities or private individuals, allowing them to hide illicit activity and exempt themselves from legal obligations. So the research question in this paper will be the following. Can those due diligence policy be enforced? Are there unintended consequences? And what is the effect of such policies when you have a very large economy like the US that unilaterally implements it in the presence of mechanism of regulation avoidance? So what I do in this paper is that I study the US Dodd-Frank Act conflict mineral rule that regulates a very specific set of countries and a very specific set also of minerals. And this new rule also creates some disclosures that allows me to collect new data on mineral supply chains. Second, I try to estimate the cost response in the US economy for the listed firms using financial information from firms and information on unit values of downstream products using a difference and difference strategy. And third, I evaluate the economic effect of enforcement on bilateral trade using the structural gravity framework, leveraging the design of the law that targets specific countries and specific metals to implement a triple difference strategy. I use also a new measure of legal events to study the extent of regulation avoidance that arise in this case. And I use the structural gravity framework also to study general equilibrium effects. So what I find, to give you a summary of the results, is that there is a large effect on exports that drop from the targeted countries, the extraction country. But part of those of the demand that was addressed to those countries first is diverted to alternative extraction countries. Second, I find also unintended consequences. There is a large regulation avoidance. 38% of exports now go that would go to regular trade partners are now diverted to legal havens, and it seems that they are re-exported also to US suppliers. And I find further consequences, large income effects in the source countries, and I have find some substantial also administrative costs implemented by US firms. So in terms of the contribution to the literature, so this is fairly limited to the literature in economics, but I think that this work really relates to two parts of the literature in international trade. First, papers that have been interested in responsible sourcing and trade. And this is the first paper to study a unilateral responsible sourcing policy implemented at the state level and not just at the firm or group of firm level, showing that this policy has a global effect on trade. Then it's linked also to a growing literature on extraterritorial trade policies that can encompass policies that try to mitigate their country effect, or also a new type or type of geopolitical instrument like sanctions, for example. And then it's linked to a literature in public economics, also studying the role of secrecy, jurisdiction, and global compliance. And finally, there are a few papers also in development economics that try to assess the effect of the Dodd-Frank Act on conflicts in targeted extraction countries. And those papers use usually a reduced form approach, trying to take as given the extent of the shock that the Dodd-Frank Act created. And I complement this paper by being the first study to try to estimate the extent of trade adjustments that arise because of the Dodd-Frank Act. So to start, I'm going to give you a bit more context on this rule and this policy. So the Dodd-Frank Act conflict mineral rule is signed in 2010. And it's basically a rule that regulates listed US firms that use tin, tantalum, and tungsten. And those firms are very big, usually in downstream sectors like electronical components, for example, and they represent a large part of sales in the US. And what the law says is that those firms, they have, if they use one of those three metals, tin, tantalum, and tungsten, they have to try to first do a risk assessment to determine if those metals could come from DRC or an adjoining country. If they cannot provide an evidence that this is not the case, then firms have to do an extensive special report on their supply chain and the due diligence measure that they take to avoid sourcing conflict minerals from DRC or an adjoining country. The special report has to be audited by an independent third party and then publicly disclosed. And you have sanctions that exist at the Security Exchange Commission, the administration that recovers those public disclosure that exist for providing false information. And the objective of this law is really to reveal the source and production condition of metals and minerals used in products and induce worldwide compliance through the suppliers of those very big listed US firms. In terms of timing, the law was signed in 2010 and it was applied in 2013. And in the rest of the analysis, I'm going to start studying the effect of the law at the signature time, at the time of announcement, because after that, firms knew that they would have to comply with this rule. So the law regulates this area that is very large, where you have 10 countries. And in the darker part of the Democratic Republic of Congo on the map, you have a context where at more than 50% of mines of those 3T metals, you have rebel groups operating. Interestingly, we have anecdotal evidence that the regulation was unanticipated by the local miners there. And the mining industry in this region is very large. This is a very large share of tantalum that is supplied in this region. And for the two other metals, this region is very attractive because usually the price is lower than in other sourcing countries. And typically in this region, there is no smelting or transforming industry. Are very little, so minerals tend to be exported to smelters and refiners abroad before entering industrial supply chains. So think about a firm that would be a supplier of one of those big US listed firms. Now that you have the Dodd-Frank Act, or you know that the Dodd-Frank Act conflict mineral rule has been announced, you have basically three choices. The first one would be that you keep importing from this region, but now you have to comply with this due diligence policy and pay associated costs. So there would be compliance costs, making sure that you're not sourcing conflict minerals. But you could face also some collective reputation effect if it's complicated to distinguish from this region between products what is conflict-free and not conflict-free. And then you could face also some degree of legal uncertainty as the supplier of the US firm that is not directly regulated by this law. Second option that you have, you could basically change the source country of the metals and the minerals. However, we've seen before that there is a limited set of exporters often for those metals, and completely changing also your sourcing might induce other costs. And the last option that you have, if you want to keep sourcing from those countries, but you want to avoid one of those three costs that comes with due diligence, you could try to avoid this regulation, and you do so by avoiding the disclosure and transparency that it creates. And you're going to try to opacify basically the transaction and information on where you source. And you can do that through territories that are designated as legal havens from the international law literature. And so what could happen are those three mechanisms. First, for trade between DRC and the neighboring countries, there could be first a new trade barrier created by the Dodd-Frank Act conflict mineral rule, so lowering trade between DRC and the US and its suppliers. Second, we would see a trade diversion effect when US and suppliers try to source from other producers of the same metals. And the third effect would be a trade diversion and then a regulation avoidance effect, where you would see that exports from DRC and neighboring countries start transiting through very opaque countries and then are redirected to US end suppliers of the listed firms. So if you don't have any question at this stage, I'm going to jump to the data that I use in the paper. So first, I use data on reported mineral trade. In the paper, I'm abstracting completely from effect that the law could have on unreported mineral trade. So this is going to be trade at the origin, destination, product, and year level. And I limit my sample to trade flows of mineral products, mineral and metal products only. And I can observe trade flows in volume and value. And I reconstruct internal flows that are very important in general equilibrium in the structural gravity framework using production data that has been harmonized with the BASI trade data. Second, I have information also on the listed US firms available through Compustat, where I can find a lot of data on the financials of those firms. And so I can observe sales, production costs, and administrative costs in value for many of those firms, and firms that are as big as those ones, but are not regulated under the Dodd-Frank Act that I will use as a control. And then from the information that was provided by part of the treated firms, so 700 of them, I can also retrieve information on the suppliers of metals of those US regulated firms. So in the report that public report that those firms give, I collect and process information on the supplier's name, the metal that was supplied, and the country where the supplier is operating. The limit of this data source is that those are suppliers that are revealed after the law is implemented, so suppliers that are supposed to comply with the Dodd-Frank Act conflict mineral rule. There might have been some adjustments between the implementation of the signature of the law and its implementation that I cannot observe. And the last part of data that I use that comes from a complementary, another working paper is a new database on legal havens. So what are legal havens? We've seen that those are jurisdictions that have a set of laws that create what is called legal opacity. And this is a concept that has been developed by an international law scholar to try to focus on international regulation avoidance. With this analogy also with the tax haven, but here focusing really on regulation avoidance. And from the literature in public economics and international law, we know that legal opacity that is supplied by those legal havens come from many legal dispositions that we can classify in four broad dimensions. The first one would be banking and financial secrecy. The second one would be the existence of legal structures and vehicles that are very secretive. Think about like special types of companies or any other legal structure. The third one would be internal policies and regulation, the fact that you regulate less or defined in a more lenient way some economic crimes and offenses internally. And the fourth dimension of secrecy, of legal opacity, is the low international cooperation. So you're shielding any economic agents that go through your territory by not providing information to other jurisdictions that would try to investigate on those economic agents. So what I do in a complementary paper is that I construct a new database on all of those legal dispositions, combine them in a legal opacity index, and define legal havens as the very top secretive countries according to this index. Of course, I have a lot of robustness tests in the way I define choose this cutoff and aggregate dimension and sources that I'm happy to discuss about. So what are those legal havens? You would find countries that are the usual suspect as tax havens or offshore financial centers. For example, you have Switzerland or Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, but you have also other countries like Malaysia. And this list of legal haven is very complementary to other measures that exist in terms of tax haven and offshore financial centers, meaning that this is positively correlated, but it's not a perfect correlation, meaning that we capture really another dimension of this. So I'm gonna start jumping into the econometrics analysis there, starting with what happens for the firms that are regulated, because this law is implementing new disposition, but with a limited degree of constraint. So we wonder kind of what is the compliance cost that it created for those firms. So what I'm using here is the set of firms that are treated, and I can observe in CompuStats. And I compare those firms with other firms filing to CompuStats. So all of those big listed firms that file to the Security Exchange Commission in the US. And I'm going to compare firms within the same industrial sector. And I'm going to study how firm sales evolve before and after the law, but also production and administrative costs that I rescaled by sales to try to approach more of a unit cost. Of course, I have robustness also using the total production and cost, administrative cost in value, and I can show you robust with those. And the important coefficient here is going to be beta here, that is going to capture the effect of the Dodd-Frank Act for firms that are regulated, so have to file under the Dodd-Frank Act after its signature time. And I control also for the size of the firm, so the log of firm assets and the log of firm employee to control for capital and labor. And firm and sector time fixed effect are going to control for this defensive structure and compare firms within a sector. So here are the results at first. So in the column 1 and column 4, you see the effect on sales, and then column 2 and 5, the effect on production costs, and 3 and 6 on administrative costs. And at first, if we look at the average effects, we observe that there is a slight decrease in sales value after the Dodd-Frank Act. But at the same time, administrative costs per dollar earned increases after the Dodd-Frank Act is implemented. And this variable of administrative cost is going to capture everything in the firm's cost that is not directly related to the production of goods and services. So any expense that is linked to administrative and sales services and so on. Now, in the column 4 to 6, what I do is that I distinguish the firm that have like the simplified filing and the firm that implements really the whole due diligence process. And we see in column 6 that the firms that file this very extensive conflict mineral report are the ones that face an increase in administrative cost. And this is equivalent, this increase to $30,000 more per year. In a second analysis, I investigate what is the role of supply chains in driving those compliance costs. And what I find is in column 2 and 3 is that actually these costs interacting the variable for regulated firm filing those extensive reports and disclosing suppliers, this administrative cost increase with the size of your network, the number of your supply network, the number of suppliers that you have, and also with your upstreamness, so how close you are to the mine, basically. And for firms with disclosing their suppliers, which tend to be bigger, for the average number of suppliers, I find that the increase yearly in compliance cost is $70,000, which would amount to basically hiring one more person in your administrative services. So we see that there is this compliance that seems to take place. Now let's look at what happens to international trade. First, showing you preliminary evidence. From the data in metal suppliers of those US firms, what is interesting is that we see that the metal suppliers of the firms, the US firms that are regulated, tend not to be only in the US. So here in this graph, each bar corresponds to the share of suppliers declared by those firms in each country. So you see that the majority of suppliers that are actually disclosed are in China. Second, you have the US, but you have also a lot of them in Indonesia, in Japan, and in Germany. So we expect that the effect of the Dodd-Frank Act will take place not only between DRC and the US, but also between DRC and all of the trade partners where you have this extensive US presence. Now, if we look unconditionally to what happens to the export of the targeted countries, so DRC and the 9 neighboring countries, here, this is what is plotted on this graph. So on the left panel, you have the export in volume, and on the right in value. In orange, you can see the 3Ts, and in gray, you see the other minerals and metals that are extracted in this region. So the control product. And you see that in orange, there is a big drop at the time of signature of the law of export of DRC and adjoining countries compared to the control product. And we see that actually in value, this is less stark, this drop, because there is at the same time an increase in global prices of those 3T metals. And I'm going to account for that in the triple difference strategy.
One quick question: what is the difference between the one in the left and the right? Is it?
So on the left, this is export volumes, so in tons exported, and on the right, this is value. So this would be in dollar. And this is the index based to the year before the law is signed. So you see that export drop and in tons at the time of the signature of the law. And they also decorrelate in value, but because you have a price effect at the same time, so the price of the 3T increases on global market at the same time, the difference between the two is less stark for export in value. So we see that there is this drop in export of the regulated metals compared to other metals from DRC and the adjoining countries to all of their trade partners. But actually, at the same time, there is some reallocation in taking place, meaning that what we can do is look at this here series of export volume of 3T and look at what share of those exports is going to legal havens, those very opaque countries. And this is what is plotted on this graph for each of the 3T metal extracted in this area. What is the series here is the export share to legal havens. So what share of export goes to those territories. And before the law is signed and implemented, you see that this is fairly stable, this export share, and it starts increasing after the Dodd-Frank Act is signed and after its implementation in 2013-14. So there is reallocation taking place here. So now to estimate all of this effect, I'm going to make use of the structural gravity framework. So the gravity relationship that if you do, those of you that do trade already know well, is basically this relationship, this theoretical relationship that tells you that bilateral trade between two countries is a function of the total output of the origin country and expenditure of the destination country. But this is also a function of trade barriers existing between those two countries. So the bilateral trade flows, think about tariffs, distance, language, and so on, but also the multilateral resistance terms that are those pi IT here and p JT here that capture how integrated you are as an origin or destination country with the rest of the world. And in this theoretical setting, we expect that the Dodd-Frank conflict mineral rule is going to change the trade cost vector for all origin countries that are targeted by the Dodd-Frank Act with all of their trade partners. So we will see an increase in this TIGT for all of those type of pairs of countries. The only thing is that this is very challenging to estimate accounting at the same time for multilateral resistance term for origin countries because this will affect trade flows to all partner countries. So the idea here is that I will need to use another control groups than what is available only looking at 3T exports. So I'm going to make use of the fact that we have other mineral products also, and therefore build a control group. So I will implement a triple difference strategy, comparing trade flows from DRC and adjoining countries of 3T products to trade flows of the same countries but of other mineral products. Trade flows also from different countries exporting 3Ts but that are not regulated by the Dodd-Frank Act. And the last control group will be other products from other countries. And the identification assumption here is that the relative change of 3Ts compared to other products in the regulated countries would have been the same than in the rest of the world. So this is a relative parallel trend. So this is the equation that I estimate bilateral trade between I and G in mineral products. And the term of interest will be this DRC to rest of the world, which is an interaction term for being a regulated origin country to a trade partner that is not regulated of 3T after 2010. And I control for RTAs, regional trade agreements, and internal flows also to exclude them from the control group. And I include fixed effect for dyads, pairs of country at the product level, product time fixed effects, and then origin time and destination time fixed effect, which will account for multilateral resistance term from the structural gravity equation. And so the term of interest will be this beta DFA, which will capture the net effect of the Dodd-Frank Act on 3T export from the targeted countries, the regulated countries, to the rest of the world. And I can study the heterogeneity in this beta to study how different type of trade partners react to the Dodd-Frank Act. So here are the results, the baseline results. So in the first column, you see that actually the effect of the Dodd-Frank Act is negative, seems large, but is very noisy because there is a lot of heterogeneity in the way trade partners respond to this Dodd-Frank Act. So in column 2, I distinguished the legal haven premium that is taking place here. So here the first coefficient would be the effect for regular trade partners. And we see that there is a big drop that is negative and large. And this is this amounts to a drop in 73% in exports from DRC and adjoining countries to the rest of the world. And the second coefficient captures the legal haven premium. And we see that being a legal haven basically offsets these due diligence effects. And this is why we see this reallocation of trade flow going to more extensively to legal havens. Second, in column 3, I studied the export of other 3T producers to the rest of the world. So for example, an alternative producer would be Brazil, for example, of tantalum. And we see that for those alternative producers, there is an increase in their exports after the Dodd-Frank Act is signed and implemented. And this is around a 20% increase in exports. In column 4, I test for an alternative also channel of regulation avoidance. What if the regulated countries, so DRC and adjoining countries, were exporting now to other treaty producers to try to hide and re-export from them their product to hide the origin country. But this coefficient is close to 0, and I find no such effect here. So the regulation avoidance channel, only one that I find is through those legal havens countries. In the second step, what I do in the paper is to study, okay, now to which countries are those legal havens exporting them? So this is what I do in this table. So here now I limit on the origin destination to countries for which I have this legal haven measure defined. So for this limited sample, this is the re-estimating my equation basically 3 here on this first column. And then column 2, I check first more generally, do legal havens export more treaty to the rest of the world during this period? So I see more of a negative effect here. So to all of their trade partners, they tend to export less. And this makes sense because on the other side, the import side, I was finding that during that same period of time, those legal havens tend to import less also from the rest of the world, except for DRC and regulated countries. But when we look at whether legal havens export more to the US, we find actually this big increase in treaty exports between legal havens and the US. And what I can do also is check whether for other trade partners, check where we have more metal suppliers that are disclosed. Remember those bars of shares of metal suppliers of those US firms that I showed you in the graph. Actually, when we look at that, we see that also legal havens tend to reallocate their exports more to those countries as well. So if you compare two countries where you do have suppliers of metals of US firm, you find that actually a one standard deviation increase in the share of those suppliers increase the import of treaty from legal havens by 12%. And finally, so I have a lot of robustness tests and alternative results that I'm happy to discuss later. But I'd like to end on the more general equilibrium effect that takes place due to this policy. So I've showed you all of those reallocation channel, but this is quite difficult to put a number on like the magnitude of diversion that happened there. And this is something that we can do using the full gravity system and this general equilibrium setup. So we have this gravity equation that tells us that bilateral trade is a function of trade cost between two countries. So this red term here is impacted by the Dodd-Frank Act. We have an increase in trade cost between DRC and its trade partners that are not legal havens. So we will see a decrease in bilateral trade. That's what we've observed in a reduced form. But at the same time, there will be other adjustments because DRC now faces an increase in trade costs. It means that DRC is less integrated with the rest of the world as a global market. So DRC is going to try to reallocate export to other destinations that are not affected by this increase in trade cost. And another reallocation effect is going to through this term PJT that we already saw a little bit, is that, okay, now the rest of the world is less integrated because we have this increase in trade cost. So other countries that were sourcing from DRC at first are going to reallocate their demand to other countries that export treaties. And a last general equilibrium effect is the effect on prices. Here, this third order effect is that, okay, now I'm one of the countries targeted by the Dodd-Frank Act, so DRC and an adjoining country, and I cannot export easily my product to the world market now. So what I will do to keep exporting is that I will drop the price that I ask for those products. And this is this green price effect here that will in turn affect the total income of the extraction countries. So what I observed doing this general equilibrium exercise, so simulating the economy with and without the Dodd-Frank Act, is that basically, okay, in reduced form, we saw that export from DRC and neighboring countries drop to the rest of the world, but they tend to concentrate to legal havens. Well, what is the share of trade flows that are diverted to legal havens? Actually, if we take trade flows as we observe them at the time of signature of the law, and we simulate this economy with and without the Dodd-Frank Act, we can compute that 30% of the export that should have gone to regular trade partners are now re-exported to legal havens. Second, we have this lower access now for extraction countries to the global treaty markets, which will generate an income change. And we have a lot of anecdotal evidence of this mechanism taking place. So from this paper, for example, we know that for this example of one mine, so this is a very extreme example, but this illustrates well this effect. After the law was signed, actually, the price of the tin ore dropped from $8 per kilogram to $2.5 per kilogram. And so with this general equilibrium framework, I can try to estimate which countries are harmed by this price effect and which benefits. And what I find is that for DRC and adjoining country, there is a drop by 18% in the relative price at the mine gates. And this effect would be magnified if those countries could not sell to legal havens. And I think that here, in terms of welfare, it's interesting to think a bit like about who is affected by this drop in prices. Will it be more in the extraction countries, the rebel group, for example, or will it affect also the artisanal miners? And second, what I estimate is that if you are a legal haven now, you have this legal opacity technology and you can implement regulation avoidance. What is interesting is that you will not pay the trade cost and you will start having access to low price minerals and your price index in treaty drops after the law is signed and implemented. So to finish and conclude, we've seen that the conflict mineral rule introduced due diligence, new administrative costs. And what is interesting in terms of the compliance potential is that even though it's unilateral, only from the US, there is a large worldwide compliance. But there is diversion effect through legal havens. So the design of this type of extraterritorial rule should account for the limited enforcement that you can have abroad. Second, this policy has consequences. So there is a big income shock for the extraction countries. It's important to think who will be affected by this income shock. And the legal havens, they tend to mitigate this effect and at the same time benefit from lower price and derive a rent from regulation avoidance. So that's it for me. I'm happy to have a discussion on this paper and to have all of your comments.